Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and today is episode 3 of our newest series, A Secular Bible Study, where every Thursday at 9 a.m. Central Time, we will cover one book of the Bible until the whole Protestant canon is complete, and then we will start going verse by verse. So these episodes will be roughly 20 to 30 minutes in length and will be high-level overviews where we cover the following 7 parts of our agenda. Now, I know Leviticus is everyone's favorite book, but I'd encourage you to stick with us today. It plays a really pivotal role in understanding what has happened in Genesis and Exodus and where we are going in Numbers through Joshua. So let's hop right into point 1 here, where we talk about a book overview. Now, summed up in a few words, we'd be saying priest, ritual, law, God's presence, probably. I'm going to take you through a bit more of a thorough overview, though, and help you understand where we left off. So in Exodus, God has established his covenant with Moses as a leader and also with the people of Israel, but they're not doing so good. In typical fashion of the Israelites, even though they get to hang out with the creator of the universe and they are his chosen people, they seem to not get this through their head, and they are constantly failing him and messing up to the point where God has even told Moses now, you can't be with me, man. So we start the book, and this is kind of actually cool because we see the direct opposite in the beginning of Numbers, but we start this book with God speaking to Moses on the outside of the tabernacle. So God is inside the tabernacle speaking out to Moses. Moses cannot come in. And again, we see that fixed by Numbers, and the fixing happens with these ritual rites, these laws, these rules, because really the breakdown of Leviticus is this: I, God, am so perfect and holy, and you, people, are so unholy and bad. So let's get these standings laid out properly, and then I'll tell you the things you can do that will help you to get to me. And these things just seem ridiculous, right? It seems like the kind of thing that an ancient people groups who are nomads wandering in the desert might come up with, not the creator of the universe. And these things are sacrifices and cleansing rituals, etc. They seem highly pagan in nature. They definitely have borrowed from other pagan roots and religious tribes around them, like the Canaanites, who are so evil. From a New Testament perspective, we're supposed to look back at this time and see this as the separation between God and people because of sin, and that God still, in his justice and love, paves a way. The way in the New Testament will be through the blood of Jesus, the high priest of high priests, the ultimate sacrificial being, the scapegoat. All of that is referenced because of what we see in Leviticus with animal offerings and the Day of Atonement with the scapegoat, etc. We also have some focus on priesthood here. We have Aaron and his sons becoming kind of the first priest and setting this long lineage, which is so important and will derive downwards because it was only the priest who could be as pure as possible to enter the Holy of Holies within the tabernacle, and to have these communicative and ritualistic rites that allow them to intervene between God and people. We'll get into this in more detail as we go through the themes and the literary analysis and the misconceptions and errors, etc. coming up. Point 2, though, which is going to be authorship and date, is going to be even quicker than last time because this is pretty much the same as it was for Genesis. If you want to see episode 1, point 2, where we talk about authorship and date, I'll leave a link and a time mark for you there so you can get the full nice 5-minute overview of who wrote the Pentateuch, that being the first 5 books of the Bible, and when. Again, your main 2 sources here are going to be Moses did it, which doesn't really make sense, and I've explained that, and something called the documentary theory, where we're looking at 4 different sources combined that were combined around the 6th century BCE during the Babylonian captivity or shortly thereafter, as a way to kind of group these people finally together, to take all of the oral stories and written traditions, etc. Even though there's different accountings of them and some are borrowed and some are original and some contradict, let's just mash them all together best we can. We'll scrape it out, we'll see what sticks, and that is our first 5 books of the Bible. This is the Torah. I guess the one thing that might be unique to Leviticus is to understand that, again, after that exile in Babylon, and they're coming together again as a people group and trying to say, like, okay, who are we? What do we believe? What is our roots? And how do we stay together? What is our cohesive defining features? That's what's happening in Leviticus, right? They've come out of captivity in Egypt, at least according to the story, and they are now a new people group, and they now are wandering and lost and having to rebuild identity. Identity is such a huge deal through these first few books of the Bible as we establish this chosen people group and we give more detail to that identity, and that is a big part of Leviticus as well. In terms of timing, aside from when it was written, but when these events were supposed to be happening, there's not much in Leviticus saying how long this period is covered or how far after certain events in Exodus, but if we look at Numbers, we can see a very specific time frame. It's like the first day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year. So 26 months in a day, essentially, since they left Egypt is when Numbers starts, which seems to be picking up right after the end of Leviticus. So at least some of Leviticus we can just know is around the second year. How far it goes back in these events is kind of hard to say, and most of this is them hanging out around Sinai. They're wandering for 40 years, and something that's interesting to note that we see at the end of Exodus is once the tabernacle is established, God likes to just chill for a while, and he shows himself as this pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, and that rests directly within and over the tabernacle. And as long as that cloud was in the tabernacle, don't pack up the tent. We're not going anywhere. But when that cloud would start to move, all the rituals of how we treat the tabernacle and take it down and pack it up and how we're going to transition it and move it, etc., to follow the cloud to the next resting place, that begins. So a lot of people like to say, hey, it should have been an 11-day walk from leaving Egypt until Canaan. Why did it take 40 years? God wasn't trying to do it directly, according to the story. This is a 40 years, and that number 40 is very important. It usually symbolizes a time of testing, like with Jesus' 40 days of fast, the 40 days that it rained during the flood in Genesis, etc. 40 is this trial period. So he's got to iron out the details with his people. He has to help them figure out who they are, what their laws are, how to keep those laws, how to atone when they break those laws, how to become pure like him before he can take them to the promised land. Again, this is the biblical setup. I'm not saying that this actually happened or that there is this God or that this is actually his intention, but this is the heart of the story. So I just kept talking there, and I've been in point 3 here for a minute, which is historical background and accuracy. And there's not a whole lot we can say here because, again, this doesn't take place on a grander scale like with Egypt, and we can compare the Egyptian records to this. This is just them now. They're alone. They're in the wilderness. It's their word and their God. That's all we've got. What we can see in terms of understanding something of history is that this is an ancient Near Eastern tribe, and that there are a lot of similarities between ancient Near Eastern tribes that have storm or war gods that represent them as a people group that help them prosper, do well in battle, and take over neighboring nations. That is what is happening here in Leviticus. And so we can see a reflection of the time, and that these people had a very similar concept of things as their neighbors did, whether we're talking about slavery, whether we're talking about cleanliness, right? Like, it's interesting to think about what was their idea of what made them unclean. Now, some of it was theological and spiritual, but some of that even was based off just an idea of, well, that's associated with death. So you see a lot of how you become unclean in Leviticus. And the main things are touching things that are unclean. So this could be certain kinds of meat. This could be dead bodies. This could be certain bodily fluids. And this was par for the course at this time, that when we still didn't understand germ theory, we had some kind of an understanding that disease lingered. And if you touched diseased skin, your skin would then get diseased, etc. And we didn't have the right words or science to put to it, but we had a cultural understanding of unclean and impure and clean and pure. And applying that to the theology of a perfect God in a very clean union, we have to understand the physical things that will make us unclean. So again, this is kind of the points I've mentioned in other videos where we focus so much on what women should do when they're menstruating and what men should do if they have a wet dream. Both of these are covered in Leviticus, by the way, as well as a ton of other stuff that you would just think is asinine. But it might have been important to this people group at an earlier time as they're really trying to establish right from wrong, good from bad, clean from ugly, etc. And though I agree that it's unnecessary to have this much level of detail in comparison to, say, how much we talk about that people should be free, or that all people are equal, or that children should not be sexually abused, etc. Like, we have this disproportionate focus from supposedly the creator of the universe at his first iteration of giving rule and law to his people. A lot of people like to look at the fact that this is Mosaic law or Levitical law, and that it has been usurped by the blood of Jesus, and that these things we are no longer bound to. From a Christian perspective, we've all but done away with all of these rules and laws, except when we're still hung up on homosexuality, or we don't like the idea of tattoos, and then we'll bring out some of these Levitical laws and say, look, abomination, look, you're marking yourself for the dead, etc. But very few Christians have any qualms with being around their wife when she's menstruating, or the waiting period they need to address after they've had a nightly emission. And I see almost no one in the Christian community, for reasons that apply to the Levitical laws, staying away from pork. So in my opinion, if these laws are really for these people at this time in this context, let's leave them there and not cherry pick this like we do. I talk about this quite a bit in my video from last Sunday where we talked about gay marriage, and a lot of it is founded right here in Leviticus. Also in my video about quantifying the Bible and understanding who God is by the word count and data that's provided in this 800,000 word tome, we see an overemphasis on these things that seemingly don't matter at all, compared to things that a moral and just God should have been talking about more. I digress. It's not the point of a secular Bible study. We'll move on to literary analysis here for point 4. So similar to Exodus, our main genre here is that of ancient Near Eastern legal or law or ritual. This is all done in a very similar fashion. It all uses a lot of the same literary techniques. One of those techniques that is employed often in this kind of genre is that of repetition. We need to drive a point home. You'll see things said multiple times or in groups of 3 or listed forwards and then backwards. Then we typically see a secondary layer of detailed instructions to back up the first, and then in case this wasn't clear enough, we'll do a third layer of symbolic imagery. So we see this with the detail of the law again being don't do this is forbidden, avoid this, right? The repetition, saying it in different ways, and then the symbolic we'll see with like the blood. We need imagery to help us understand that it is the blood of this animal that has died, or the scent of the burning flesh of the animal that has pleased God. And it's this pleasing motion to God, or this atonement notion for God, that allows him to connect with us because now we are clean, right? Doing the law keeps us clean. Making the sacrifice makes us atoned, but we needed imagery, and that imagery has become so important. Think about the blood of Christ. It's the simple fact of Christ's death that equals atonement, but we've connected it with his blood specifically, in parts because it was very much tied to pagan rituals of blood magic, where you would actually utilize the blood in some capacity for the magic. But here we've made it more of a symbolic gesture about the blood of Christ covering. We see this again with the Passover, where we're painting blood on the door back in Exodus so that the angel of death passes over the houses and does not kill their firstborn. It was blood magic that protected these people. But in concluding this point, I mean, it is just highly structuralized. We see a beginning part where we are listing rituals, laws, and priesthood. We see a middle part with the Day of Atonement, and then we see a reflection back to those laws and priestly rituals on the back end as well. Point 5 here is going to be our main themes. And I'm not sure how many different themes I'm going to list, but I know I want to start with religious rituals. There's multiple kinds of rituals done by multiple people for multiple reasons, but when we talk about sacrifice, which is the first one I want to point out, it really comes down to 2 kinds of sacrifices. And this is right at the beginning of Leviticus. You have sacrifices to say thank you to God, and you have sacrifices to say, uh-oh, I sinned. Let's make this better. So I'm going to get my Bible out so I can be a little more precise because it's just easier to read the headings here. But you have laws for burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings. That's 1, 2, and 3. 4 is sin offerings. In 5, we get to guilt offerings. And then in 6, we start getting into the priesthood. So those first 5 kinds of offerings really break down into those 2 main categories, to say thanks or to say sorry. It's interesting to talk about the guilt and peace offerings, but not nearly as interesting to talk about the burnt offerings. I think it's either 42 or 47 times is listed God saying how much he loves the smell of burning flesh. And this is how gods of the ancient Near East, by the way, consumed their sacrifices. There was a corporeal aspect where sometimes we would see the gods eating, but most of the time it was the wafted pleasure that filled the gods' bellies, is how we see it in so many texts, including in these older tradition texts here. The scent of the burnt offering is what did the deed, and then the priest actually would get to use that meat for their own sustenance as well as to sell to make money. This is why it was so important not to eat meat that a different tribe that worshipped a false god was selling, because that false god in some cases was actually just a demon, and thus you were eating impure meat because it had been sacrificed to a demon. Now this is what a branch of new scholars has tried to establish instead of what it really looks like according to the Old Testament, is that there's a pantheon of gods out there. God speaks about other gods all the time, at least in the Old Testament, and then all of a sudden at some point he becomes a singular god. But the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, having no other gods before me, etc., at this time, at this place, to these people, if you want to talk about context, would have been denoting that he is the best God, that he is the most powerful God. We hear about it being God versus God as battles would happen on the battlefield. In fact, we have this picture of, I think it's Joshua and Aaron holding up Moses' arms during a battle. And as long as they do this, then Yahweh has the power to defeat the God of the other tribe on the other end of the battlefield, whose leaders are performing some kind of same ritualistic nature to get him to be more powerful. But I'm getting way off base here. There's just so much I want to get to and help you guys understand about the origin of Yahweh and how we've really changed his nature and what he has said and declared about himself in the state of this world and of other gods and things like this to suit our Christian idea of what this God should be. Okay, so that's offerings and rituals. Theme 2 is going to be around purity. And this is a state. This isn't like sin, which is an action. Impurity is a state of being impure. And you can be impure simply by touching something you shouldn't have touched. And it's not even that you shouldn't have touched touched it. Obviously, you're going to bury your dead, but now you've touched the dead. Now you're impure, and you need to go through a ritual to become pure again, especially before entering any capacity into God's presence, which is going to be more important for the priest, but also for everyone to maintain a certain level of pureness. So this is where we get all the regulations on dietary restrictions, the handling of corpses, what to do with skin disease, and the big one again, this one that's so important to God, is that of bodily fluids. And I can't emphasize enough how important this was to God. He simply couldn't. His nature could not allow it. In fact, we see Aaron's sons, and there's different ways of interpreting this, that they're either being boldly blasphemous here or that they're doing it with the best of intentions and just didn't get it right. But either way, they mess up in their ritual as priests. They were sons of Aaron, and Aaron was the main priest, but he's training his sons to be priests, and they mess up, and God immediately smites them. We get so much smiting in these books. It almost should require its own episode where we talk about God's immediate killing of people and also how he did it, because he really likes to play with a lot of different methods. In this case, if I'm recalling correctly, it has to do with consuming fire. Lit them up. Bam. And it just sucks if you think about it. So often we just think about these people as kind of characters in a story, but we're supposed to take these individuals in this story as very literal. We had a literal Moses who literally delivered his people from Egypt, where there was a literal Pharaoh who kept them in captivity. Moses had a real wife and real brothers and sisters, etc., and Aaron is his brother. So Aaron's gone with him through this whole journey, right? He's seen Moses do all of these things. He gets handed this incredible right to be the first true priest of Israel. He's training his sons, Moses' nephews, in how to do this. He's taking it as serious as you can. So these sons, the nephews of Moses, are sitting there and they do the wrong thing with the fire. I'm sorry, I don't have all the details in front of me right now. And then bam, God lights them up. Imagine how Aaron felt after that. Imagine the conversation Aaron and Moses had later away from the tent about why God did that, if it imparted any doubt at all. Like, it is just insane that if this is a real story, how it would have actually impacted these people. And to see them mess up again and again and again in certain very specific and highly correlated numbers, etc., it really makes it sound all very fake, I think, than understanding this to be a literal story. I just encourage you to think about these stories in a new way if you haven't, because it's one thing to see them as myth, it's another to see them as a Bible story that's from the Old Testament, that's important, but not nearly as important as Jesus. But this is 75% of the Bible is the Old Testament, and 20% is happening in this first 5 books. This is the setup of everything. Let's give it some attention here. That's why I think it's so interesting to go through these books in even as short details we're doing in these videos, but there's a lot more you can find out there. But as always, I'm getting off hand, so let's go with one last theme, which is going to be that of moral justice. And I chuckle because good Lord or bad Lord, the only word I would not ascribe after reading through the laws of Leviticus is moral. Do you have some good ones? Sure. Are they anything special? Nope. Are there anything revolutionary that we haven't seen by pagan tribes and people of the wrong gods and demonic possession that came up with the exact same things? Nope. But it's very important to bring up because this is where we get so much of the law and order from God. In fact, we get, in my opinion, the number one most damning verse for taking God as a moral God in this book of the Bible. It's represented elsewhere as well, but I believe it's Leviticus 25:44 through 45. Let me check. Yep, verse 44. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. Case closed. See my video on slavery, but if I hear one more freaking excuse trying to say that this is indentured servitude, nope, that's back on verses 28 through 29 and all over the place. Those are for the Israelites, about Israelite people, but you can have straight up slaves that you can buy from the neighboring nations around you. And we see this played out because God endorsed it, condoned it, whatever word you want to use. Many of you in the comments have said regulate it, whatever. He just got done giving all the thou shall nots, not just the 10 commandments about thou shall not come to me if thy is menstruating. Come on, he knows how to say no. And he did not say no slaves. He said you may. He said, here's how. And if you think the indentured servitude helps, it doesn't, because it's separate. And even in indentured servitude, you get chattel slavery, because if you have a wife or a baby during that time, they stay even when your servitude is up. That is hands down the clearest thing I have ever seen that a baby can be born into slavery because of this book, Leviticus, in this Bible. That is what your God is okay with. In a very book where he spends chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter talking about what you can't do, what you can't eat, how you can't sit, what kind of fire you should use, what smells good, what smells bad, he didn't say, no slaves. He said, yes, slaves, here's how, enjoy. It's that simple. Gosh, I could just end it here and say that a million times over and still people won't understand it. There is no defense. So for moral and ethical issues to be a theme of Leviticus, I think is hilarious. We'll call it lack of moral and ethical issues, but that is technically what is still trying to come across in this corrupt book, Law and Order. But all right, let's move on to point 6, reception and influence. I've gone longer than I meant to, so I'm going to say less words about this, but really the main things here are kind of threefold. You have the Jewish traditions. This is highly important to them. We see people honoring a lot of these rules and still trying to live by certain aspects of them that they've deemed still necessary and important. For however incorrect or unnecessary I think it is in terms of this people group being affected by these rules, here it is, it's real. In terms of Christian tradition, the reception and influence is what it does later with Jesus and what that's been doing for the last 2,000 years. You know, one thing I haven't talked much about that is a central part, literally and figuratively, of Leviticus is that of the Day of Atonement, where, hey, maybe all this stuff has gone wrong and all these offerings did or didn't work and there could be exceptions for this or that, but the priest on this day, one day a year, can take 2 goats and kill one to sacrifice for the whole of Israel and let the other go, the scapegoat, off into the wilderness. And we see this kind of theology enacted in fruition through Jesus Christ and his death on the cross. But even the very idea of a scapegoat, which so many of us are familiar with and use in different terminology even to this day, comes from this book, the third book of the Bible, Leviticus. And then the third one would be that of scholarly reception, which we've talked about to a pretty good degree. So let's move on to our last point 7, which is kind of a catch-all for contradictions, errors, misconceptions, where we can just talk more about what's wrong. There's not that many in Leviticus compared to some others. Like in Exodus, we got to talk about all the physical claims made, where we had the Egyptian records to show that those claims were at odds, right? And in Genesis, we could compare things like the creation account in Noah's Ark against what we know about the universe and archaeology. But again, this story is really taking place in its own little bubble at this time. That being said, there's some small contradictions that we could point to. As an example, it could be the duration of offerings. In Leviticus 1:3, we see that it should be at the entrance of the tent, but in Leviticus 17, it says it shouldn't be outside the tabernacle. Like, this doesn't work, which is probably why Aaron's sons died, because they couldn't keep track of all of these things that didn't make sense together. This is one example, but there's actually quite a few like this. We have some differences into how to observe the Sabbath. So in Leviticus, we're talking about how we should not even do offerings on the Sabbath, but then there's exceptions for that in Numbers. And the way that we read Leviticus is that there should be no exceptions whatsoever. So for a book later, God to be changing his mind about these things is very confusing. The treatment of foreigners, I already mentioned Leviticus 25:44, which definitely says we can go and buy slaves, but then earlier in Leviticus, I think it's 19, we see that we shouldn't mistreat, whatever that means, foreigners living among us. So it's like, okay, as soon as they come into some invisible barrier that we're calling the Israelite nation, now they're not foreigners or they ours. Very confusing. But if you're ever in doubt and you ever need a slave for sex or for work, you can just go to a neighboring nation and then you'll be fine. And if you do happen to get one from your own nation, don't worry, there's a ton of stuff you can do to make sure that you get them for at least 7 years or you get their children or wife. But again, we have this error here. We also get contradicting punishments in Leviticus. For example, in Leviticus 20:10, we see that when an affair has been had, the man and the woman should die. But just a verse later in 21:9, we see that when a woman commits adultery, it is just her that should burn. That's more contradictions, but in talking about misconceptions, we get a lot of misconceptions about penalties here. Leviticus talks about killing your children if they bring dishonor to you or disobey, stoning them specifically. Yet in following books, we see that we should only kill our children if they're trying to lead us astray from the wrong God. So is it just disobedience or is it blasphemy against God's spirit? Either way, killing your children seems to be totally fine. And a lot of my video about how God feels about not only abortion, but killing infants and children comes from Leviticus. Last would be festivities and events, whether it's Passover, the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Weeks. We see traditions and time observance here that does not match up in other books. So not necessarily just within Leviticus, but definitely within the canon. And there's plenty of misconceptions here. There's misconceptions on both ends of the aisle. There's misconceptions that these laws were just for these people just at one time. And then there's the idea that this represents who God is because God claims to be immutable. And if these things matter to God at one time, we should probably consider that they matter to him forever. And that's where we see the cherry picking, right? Okay, God is immutable, but when he talked about meat, he only meant it for these priests because that was before Jesus. So I don't have to worry about that. But when he says that two men lying together is an abomination, I'll quote that at my local anti-pride parade. Like, well, which is it? So it's more the modern day Christians' interpretation of which parts of Leviticus are useful to them or not that seem to be one of the main misconceptions we see coming from this book. But I think that's where I'll end it for today. I think there's a lot to think through there. I think that Leviticus is one of the most problematic books in the entire Bible for God's character, while at the same time being one of the most important books in the Bible for the Jewish and Christian traditions, as it establishes further not only the nation of Israel, but God's availability to commune with mankind. So again, I hope you learned something from today. If you have anything to add, any other points that are of interest from Leviticus, anything you think that I got wrong, I've learned a lot from you guys on both Genesis and Exodus so far. I try to put this together as carefully as I can to represent things as factually and objectively as true as possible. Of course, some of my own opinions are getting in there and I'm fine with that. But when it comes to the facts, whatever they can be known, I'm trying to be really, really clear. So thank you for your input. Please continue to do so. Have a wonderful day. And until next time, keep thinking.